So I guess the first thing we want to say is if the whole theme of this, I think the main theme of what we want to say is that you guys should be thinking when you're creating, when you get an assignment about creating a story, not about creating an ad or creating a big idea even. I know that's a little controversial, or even creating some kind of spectacle. We would argue that what you should be thinking about is always like, what's the story you're telling people? What's the story you're involving people in? We like that because story is something that's intrinsically human. Ever since man kind of started socializing with other man, even before they had language, they had stories. So what you see in kind of cave paintings are stories. And there's just this idea that storytelling is like a basic human need. It's actually how we structure the world around us, and how we organize information and how we make sense of things. So if you can give people stories, you're actually giving them a way to make sense of things, and there's like a basic human desire for that. It kind of hits much deeper and more meaningful than on the level of like spectacle or information. So one thing to think about is that stories are better at conveying information than straight data or spectacle. I think a lot of times, I say this because a lot of times I think as creatives, we all want to kind of create amazing, cool looking shit that may or may not actually, might be really interesting in the experience of it, but may not linger with people. And clients often tell you, like, we really need to communicate this one piece of data to people. We want to communicate that we're 20% less, or that we have this new engine, or that we're now made of all natural products. And I think a great thing to tell them back is that, great, the best way if you want people to understand that information is to tell them a story about it. The people who, we try to find images for this, but they're not very pretty, but the people who are like the world's leaders in memorizing things, who win these contests where they win, remember like 200 digits in a row, basically do that by creating stories around all the data they have in their head, and that's how they can remember information. So we would argue that the best way to get people to remember something, even like the most boring product detail, is to narrativize it. I think the other thing is that stories are much more emotionally compelling than straight data or spectacle. So even if you look at, like, let's say this is just entries from Max's mint.com account, which are just basically like a bunch of dates, expenses, and things he spent them on. And I think this is just like a set of data points, but
it's not really mine.
But even if you take a minute to read it, I think what everyone just does is like you create a story around it, right? So these are like the most boring set of data points. There's no reason you would think anything of them, but like they make sense to you. They're interesting because you just created a story around them. So it's sort of like a human need to kind of create stories around it. And it's much more emotionally involving than just giving you all this data. Like you probably have like some kind of salacious story in your head, and that kind of like made you laugh, made you wince. But like you can see how already when you narrativize things, there's a little bit more emotion around them. A couple other reasons is that there's this great quote that a story well told has no defense. If you're giving people like an argument, they can argue back with you. But if you're telling people a story, they sort of have nothing they can do but sit there and listen to the story. They almost can't help themselves from listening to it, but you can't like argue back to a story. You can't contradict a story. A story kind of just is what it is.
And if it's exceptionally well told, it can be very hard to forget, which is another powerful tool.
And the last thing, which when you guys start working at agencies, is that clients love stories because they're basically easier to tell to their bosses. Almost all your clients are going to have to sell the idea you sell them to somebody else. And they're never going to be like, oh, there was this great ad where like it was an off-white background, but not quite white, but a little cream, and this person had this expression on their face. Like they're never going to be able to talk about an execution, particularly an aesthetic execution, but they are going to be able to tell a story to their clients, to their bosses very well, and that's what will help sell your ideas internally. But it's important to remember that I think advertisers kind of instinctually have this desire to just like kind of shout their information at people, and as advertisers, we should actually have a greater sensitivity to what people want to hear. People don't want to hear information shouted at you in the prettiest, most interesting sort of way, but people inherently do want to hear stories. They want to hear things that like involve them, have emotional arcs, etc. So I think if we think about making stories more, people will actually be more receptive to our ads. If you have a good story, you have to spend less time trying to interrupt people and grab their attention. We would say you should be obsessed with storytelling. We think you shouldn't be creating ads. You should be creating stories.